And we're back. Max, tell me about what's going on in the combat world.
Yeah, so I've got two things in my combat corner to talk about this week. Hopefully you should be able to weigh in on both of them. The first one is an interview ESPN's Mark Raimondi did, or not just an interview, but also an article he wrote about Jon Jones and his move to heavyweight, which is interesting on two fronts. First, we're going to talk a little about what we can expect from him at heavyweight, because the second part, which is maybe more interesting or more hype, is his status as the GOAT of mixed martial arts. So he had a very dominant start to his UFC career, and there's several asterisks on that. But the one I think anyone can talk about without getting into steroid accusations and such is that a lot of those wins are over guys with very small frames who half of them would actually go on to compete at middleweight, which just showed how the UFC started and how it evolved to a point where, like, okay, skill only gets you so far against bigger guys. And you've seen the UFC light heavyweight division shake out, where most of the guys in the top 10 have more similar frames to Jon Jones. Alexander Rakic, we talked about Anthony Smith, Thiago Santos, Alexander Gustafsson was an early model of this, Volkan Oezdemir, Yuri Prochineza, Johnny Walker. We just watched Jamal Hill last week, who's fighting against Ovince St. Preux. And that's one of the knocks on Jon Jones. When he fought Ovince St. Preux, Alexander Gustafsson, he didn't look as good as he did against Rashad Evans and Quinton Rampage Jackson, who were much smaller guys. So that's the first thing that's interesting about this move to heavyweight. He's going to have less opportunity to fight smaller guys, and it's going to be against bigger framed guys who, his last two fights, he's not looked good against Dominic Reyes and Thiago Santos. I thought he lost the Dominic Reyes fight, as did a lot of people. And in the Thiago Santos fight, Thiago's leg went out in, I think, the second round, and Jon Jones just kind of air kickboxed him. And what he's saying is that he wants to feel intimidated. He doesn't feel intimidated by these guys, which he looked intimidated against Reyes. He had to run away from him for 3 rounds before he could start jabbing and kind of panic wrestling. But I think he's more talking about in the training camp before. He wasn't training until training camp started, and then he was just going through the motions. Whereas now he's saying, these guys scare me. Francis Ngannou can knock Jon Jones out in a way that no one at light heavyweight, save for Anthony Rumble Johnson maybe, can. So he's saying that he's got a different mindset, a different mentality now going into heavyweight. So it's interesting. He's talking, he's going to wrestle more. He thinks he's going to have more power in his strikes, and that's going to make him a more dynamic, better fighter than what the looks he's shown at light heavyweight, which frankly haven't been the dominance that you kind of want to see when you watch for those signature wins by the fighter you want to call the GOAT. So that brings me to Jon Jones and the GOAT discussion. I thought first I'd ask, just as an outsider of the UFC, what do you know about Jon Jones and MMA and where he ranks among the names like Anderson Silva, GSP?
So I've always, like, any interaction I've had with Jon Jones is Sports Center, and it's like his fights are always a big deal. He's a guy that's defended his title before. He is like a complete fighter, and it seems like they hold him to a very high standard, and everyone's kind of waiting for him to even take another step. So it's like he's up there with the GSP, the Anderson Silva, these guys who have never lost and have shown complete dominance.
Just to be clear, those guys have lost.
Okay. Jon Jones hasn't, though, correct?
He has one disqualification, but he's never been beaten.
Yeah.
Although you can argue he lost to Gustafsson, he lost to Dominic Reyes, but the judges have never given him a loss.
Okay. Yeah. So he he's in that sense he's never lost, but he's a guy who like has shown the ability to be one of the greatest fighters and like dominate the competition, but you're waiting for him, and maybe it was because of the doping, but maybe you're looking for him to have like one more fight that really cements himself as like one of those next level tier of fighters.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of wanted to hear what the perspective on Jon Jones is from someone who doesn't watch every UFC card and hasn't seen most of his fights.
Baby
That's
goat.
interesting. So I, from my perspective, just one win. I don't know how I'd feel about one win at heavyweight, because what the doping does and what I talked about like his first reign in the UFC was over a previous class of what you call legends, like Lyoto Machida, Shogun Rua, Quinton Rampage Jackson, Rashad Evans, Vitor Belfort. Like those, that was the first, or you could say maybe second generation of real mixed martial artists. But Jon Jones was just the next generation, and he beat all those guys. And I think it was shockingly impressive for the fans at the time. But as a new fan, I don't look back on that and feel impressed, which maybe that's my mistake, to not appreciate the greatness of those guys. But I think if you put Alexander Gustafsson, Dominic Reyes, Jan Blachowicz, guys who are at the top now, or Gustafsson isn't, but I think the point still stands, they would do the same thing, and that Jon Jones's frame combined really helped him out there. So, and then since then, the only wins where he's really proved himself are his two fights against Daniel Cormier, who was absolutely a top competition light heavyweight. Whereas against Thiago Santos, against Anthony Smith, against Dominic Reyes last February, is like, is this really the guy we're saying is the GOAT? But in his defense, someone would say, well, no, this is a guy who's past his prime, still doing amazing things. This is Chris Paul still somehow being an all-star, even though he's not the best point guard in the league anymore. So you do have to put that asterisk on it when you evaluate his whatever we're going to see from him at heavyweight. He very well may just be past his prime and have stepped into the cage and done so many training camps that he can't be expected to perform at that high level. It's going to be interesting, though. He's got a massive chip on his shoulder. Like, did you hear about all the tweeting he was doing after Khabib's last fight?
Oh, I did catch some of that.
Man, he just, like, he was posting Instagram videos, like, he all joking. He was nonstop tweeting. Like, some guys aren't bothered by that sort of talk, and some guys are. And Jon Jones very clearly falls into the latter category. So I'm really curious to see what him stepping into a new weight class where he says he's trying harder, but at the same time, when he was talking about getting in the cage with Dominic Reyes, he said, I'm excited to put my hands on this guy. I want to hurt him. And it had me hyped for the fight. And then that's not what played out in the cage at all. So I hope this chip on his shoulder leads to a more impressive performance. I hope said performance is fueled by training, not doping. And I mean, we'll never stop revisiting the GOAT discussion in MMA, but we'll see what Jon Jones can do to add fuel to that fire.
In your eyes, what do you think to make him the undisputed GOAT, or like the GOAT? What does he have to do in this division?
He has to beat Stipe Miocic, Francis Ngannou, and Curtis Blades. If he can do that in impressive, decisive fashion, I'd be willing to overlook all the earlier asterisks and give it some serious consideration. And because what he's saying is, I don't want it to be a discussion, I want it to be a fact. And I don't know if that's even possible. Like, another name I didn't mention is Fedor, who had a 10-year legendary unbeaten run, which we're never going to see happen again, I don't believe, not in the way he did it. So if Jon Jones can beat those three guys and do it impressively without eye pokes, mind you, then I'd put him ahead of GSP. But right now, I still have GSP ahead of him.
Okay. Yeah, I just and with a GOAT conversation, you're never ever gonna have a fact. MJ has LeBron, like Wayne Gretzky got people will always make an argument for or Lemieux or Gordie Howe. And then like even in the NFL, Brady is a GOAT, but there's so many different positions. You could argue Jerry Rice, you could argue Lawrence Taylor, right? Every sport there's never going to be a fact GOAT, but there will definitely always be a discussion.
And that's what makes the a guy like Khabib so interesting too, because in terms of how long he was in the UFC for, it's not really even an argument when you compare his resume to like GSP, Silva, George St. Pierre, Demetrius. I said George St. Pierre twice, but Demetrius Johnson, Aldo, Jon Jones, they all had reigns, whereas Khabib had 2 years at the top, and he only really fought once a year at that rate. But he just did it so dominantly and he did it in what I believe is the UFC's premier division. Like Dustin Poirier, Conor McGregor, and Justin Gaethje are all champs at like any other division without so many stacked guys. So even when you want to say like, yes, on paper, Jon Jones's resume just stands out above everyone else's, you still have to go and say, okay, but he did it at this division. How about what this guy did at a scarier division in more dominant fashion? The GOAT discussion is for the fans more than for the experts, because there is no way to get an expert consensus on it, but we're going to keep talking about it.
Of course.
All right. The other thing I want to talk about is a lawsuit that has moved forward concerning the UFC. So this is an article written by Eric McGracken, who's a British Columbia lawyer and a combat sports law consultant. So in December 2014, Kung Lee, Nathan Quarry, and John Fitch, I know Kung Lee and John Fitch are former fighters, I'm not sure about Quarry, filed an antitrust lawsuit against Zuffa, the UFC's legal owner, alleging they have gained their market prominence through a series of unlawful and anti-competitive business practices, meaning illegal monopoly. And they have, with that position, artificially suppressed fighter pay. And they have filed a lawsuit alleging between $800 million and $1.6 billion of damages. So the important move forward is the judge has granted class action status, which means any fighter who competed between December 16th, 2010 and June 30th, 2017 in a UFC bout can join in on this lawsuit and sue the UFC. Now, the UFC, for its sake, is arguing that it's not a monopoly, that the existence of Bellator 1 and PFL show that they're not. And I'm not really sure how that's going to play out, because those are, on paper, mixed martial art leagues, and they do on paper have some big names. But one of the interesting things is their biggest names that I know are all released UFC fighters. The UFC will do this thing where they'll look at a guy, decide he's over the hill, and then not pay him the money that he's asking for, and let one of those secondary tier organizations break the bank to sign them. Like, they signed Eddie Alvarez for a 6-figure 6-fight contract. They signed Rory McDonald for like millions of dollars at Bellator, and the UFC let that happen. I think maybe in part because this lawsuit was going on. So it's going to be interesting, because there's now about 1,200 fighters who have the option to decide to jump in on this and try and sue the UFC. But some of those fighters are still with the UFC. And if they do that, that's really going to hurt their opportunity. And the UFC is going to almost certainly hand down retribution in the matchmaking they offer those fighters.
I think it'll be really interesting to see how the UFC fights this suit in terms of the antitrust rules, because we don't really know what sort of like market share they hold in the combat world, and if they control like more than 50%, then it they are a monopoly, and then the argument becomes a lot stronger against them in terms of the fact that they've been able to monopolize and suppress the wages of fighters. So that'll be interesting to see what sort of stats and information comes out about how much they truly own of the markets compared to Bellator and other competitive leagues. So that's the part I'll be looking at a little bit from a business perspective, because it'll be interesting to see for me. But like some people estimate they own as much as 80% of the Western Hemisphere, and that would really work against them in this case.
Yeah, I mean, one of the leagues I just named, and arguably the biggest one, operates in the Asian hemisphere. So there's that. And the other thing is, I don't like Bellator doesn't run on a pay-per-view model, whereas the UFC does. So it's harder to say market share because they have different revenue forms. But the other thing the UFC has going for them is because they're such a bigger business, they pay their fighters more than Bellator does. So I don't know how that plays out in court either. But I think it kind of lends itself to the monopolistic argument. Like the NHL can't argue, oh, we're not a monopoly because like the ECHL exists. Like it's two different.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very true. And it'll be interesting to see that is the UFC on that same status as those other major North American sports leagues, or can they argue that some of the championships in the Eastern Hemisphere that are larger kind of eat into that market share? But
It's
yeah, it's gonna be a tough argument to make.
the fucking one F, one FC likes to say they're broadcasting to billions of people. So maybe we'll see the UFC citing those claims because they have access to like the Chinese market. So that might, I don't know how the Western Eastern dynamic will play out there.
Great. Yeah, keep us updated on it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a lawsuit that's been happening over years, and this was one small step forward in it. I don't know when the next court date is scheduled for, but I mean, we're always, especially in a sport like MMA, where every time a fighter steps into the cage, they're risking their health. You want to, you don't want to see anyone step into what is the biggest representative of that sport in the world and then step out of it too injured to really function normally and with no money in the bank. And I'm watching this lawsuit to hope that it has some result on making sure that can't happen.
Yeah.
All right, that about wraps up my combat corner. We'll take a quick break and move on to some NBA talk.